So there's some major changes coming to the FAFSA, something known as the Student Aid Index. And we know there's a lot of questions out there. So on this episode of College Knowledge, we are going to dive into the potential changes on the horizon. Let you know the ins, the outs, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Okay, so make sure that you listen to this episode of College Knowledge. And after listening, if you like it, you found that information valuable, make sure to leave us a review. Let other families know that we're out there. We're here to help and pass this information along to everyone with college-bound students. So give us a like, 5-star review, share it with everybody you know who's going to be sending kids to college so they can be up to date and know more about this college process and changes that are coming shortly.
Welcome to the College Knowledge Podcast, sponsored by the College Planning Network and Paradigm Financial Group. Whether you're searching for that right fit college, applying to college, or figuring out how you're going to afford it all, you're in the right place. You'll hear from deans, admissions counselors, student athletes, and scholars from esteemed universities and colleges around the country. We'll dig deep to uncover their insight and unique experiences. So whether you're a student gearing up for college or a parent with college-bound kids, sit back, relax, and listen. Like you, we have lots of questions. Our guests have the answers, and we're excited to share them with you. Let's get started.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of College Knowledge. I'm your host today, Joe Kearns, alongside Clay Kovach. Clay, thanks for being with us. Clay's one of our education consultants. Dave is out today. He's doing a presentation on some of the changes that are upcoming with the FAFSA, and figured, you know what? There were some things that were just released last week, and Dave's doing a presentation. Why don't we do the episode today? On some of these changes. So, Clay, thanks for being with me.
Glad to be here.
So last week, it was a couple of years ago. It started with the COVID relief bill. If you guys are unaware, there was going to be some big changes coming with the FAFSA, and there's been some name changes and some things that have kind of gotten us to where we are today. But officially, it is now called the FAFSA Simplification Act.
Yep.
And it's basically been enacted already into law as part of the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, and then it was amended to the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2022. Long story short, guys, the whole FAFSA process is one that is constantly changing. But usually, it's somebody like me goes through the formula every year that it's released and understands what changes were made year to year. This upcoming year, we are potentially looking at some major changes, and wanted to go through with you a few of these. Now, a couple disclaimers for what we're going to be getting into today. We're probably going to be talking as if this thing is in effect, right? And so basically where everything lines up right now is that this will go into effect in basically for students that are their first school year is 2024, 2025.
Yep.
And if you're familiar with how the FAFSA filing works, that means that it's October of 2023. When the FAFSA opens October 1st, 2023, that's what gets filled out for the 2024-2025 school year. So as of right now, this is what we should anticipate if you have a junior, right? Yep. If you have sophomores, this is kind of the new formula that is expected to basically come up. So now, there are chances that it does get delayed. This was supposed to originally go into effect now. We were supposed to already have some of these. They did implement some small changes to the FAFSA, but not the big overhaul that they originally planned for and what they are right now planning for next year. So I believe that the latest that we should know 100% if this is going to be what you have to do is July. I think by the end of July, that's when the FAFSA formula is typically released. I think by July, they have to have it essentially good to go.
Yep.
And they are facing some, I'll say, hiccups with this new potential way that things are going to get filed. But let's go over some of the changes, kind of talk through them, get your thoughts on if you think some of these changes are good, what's good about it, what's bad about it. But just kind of give you guys an up-to-date kind of where things stand. And they released this draft to help people like us understand at least what they're thinking this formula is going to be. But at the same time, I know some of the numbers that they used in this calculation, because again, I'm one of those people that reads every line of the FAFSA formula every year. I think they used some of the numbers that were actually from like 2019, 2020, and those numbers changed even for this year's FAFSA. So I think this is a draft just to let people know kind of how things are going to work. But there's some kind of eye-opening pieces for this. So the number one thing is that they're trying to shorten this FAFSA. They're basically, the goal was to take it from a little bit over 100 questions down to about 36. And I know Dave, his first question was, well, what do you think the 36 questions are going to be? And immediately when I go through this draft, it's pretty obvious that what they're going to do is really just ask for your tax return. Mm-hmm. And it's everything will be imported from the tax return. And that's going to change a lot of things moving forward. But that's how you, instead of having to answer what's your adjusted gross income, what was your taxable interest, what was your untaxed income, what did you have in taxes paid, do you have Schedule 1? Those are a lot of questions. And when you eliminate those questions and just have one question, which is, did you file taxes? And now import your taxes.
Yep.
Yes, in theory, it's going to seem like it's going to make things, I would say, easier. But as we have probably all learned at some point in our lifetime, bills that have a specific name don't actually do what the name says.
Right.
And I joked about it and said, after I read all this, and I said, well, I'm probably not going to call this the FAFSA Simplification Act. I'm probably going to call it the College Complication Act. Yep. Because of what I think is going to essentially come out. So let's go through some of the big changes first, and then kind of dive into what I think the college process is going to look like, we'll say even next year, as early as that. So other than just reducing numbers down, first thing they're doing right now, they're going to change the name of the expected family contribution, or the EFC, to the Student Aid Index. Your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I see people get tripped up a lot with expected family contribution. Is that what I have to pay regardless? Is this what college is just going to cost me flat out, and it's going to be different every school? But my initial thought there is people are going to go from thinking, oh, this is EFC, expected family contribution, this is what I'm expected to pay. And then you switch the name over, Student Aid Index, and then it's, oh, this is how much money I'm going to get in aid.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, it's the same thing. Now, they're changing the names on this, but the reality is that what these things are going to do is the same. Both of these, the EFC or the Student Aid Index, is essentially it's a number. It's a dollar amount. And that dollar amount goes into a pretty simple formula, which is basically the cost of attendance, which is how much does a school cost for 1 year, minus this EFC or Student Aid Index. The difference between those two numbers is what your financial need is. Yeah. So essentially, they're just exchanging those three letters, EFC, and substituting Student Aid Index. Right. That's all. It's really doing the same thing.
Yep.
So again, if you guys aren't familiar with that, if a school costs $60,000 and your Student Aid Index is $30,000, you take 60 minus the 30, there's a $30,000 gap. That is your need, right? So in other words, the Student Aid Index is a number that's derived from a formula. This works a lot like taxes, that basically says this is what your family can afford for a year. So if our cost is higher than what we think you can afford, you are now eligible for need-based aid.
And that's the key word, they're eligible.
Yeah, eligible, right? So it doesn't mean, again, just like it is now, the expected family contribution is not what you're going to pay, right? Because not all schools give that need-based aid, right? But it determines if you're eligible for certain aid. So it's really that side of it is not going to change. Now, I think the big pieces, and this does not affect everybody, but I think the focus of this bill was to see who is eligible for Pell Grants. And I think they're trying to increase the amount of people that will get maximum Pell Grants. And a Pell Grant is free money from the government given to a family that gets applied to help make college affordable. Typically, it's, again, lower income families that don't have a lot of money. Again, when that EFC is low, you get a Pell Grant, right? So my initial thoughts on kind of the idea of expanding who's eligible, maybe giving more people government money. What are your first takes when you hear that maybe people aren't thinking about?
Well, I mean, there's a few things that my mind jumps to, but when you're expanding it, and the idea of doing it in theory sounds good.
Mhm.
But the process, like you had said, the college complication, right?
Yeah.
And now we get to a situation where these schools are, I think, going to be doing a little bit more than they had been in the past, or having to sift through things a little bit more.
Yeah.
I think it's going to put people where the FAFSA essentially, or the financial aid forms, the federal forms, kind of just becomes a form that you have to fill out to see how much money you're going to actually get from the government.
Yeah.
And it's trying to put it all into one form, as opposed to going out and applying to your state grants and all this stuff, trying to localize it all, put it all together. But I think in the grand scheme of things, it's going to make the process more complicated. It's going to require you to fill out more forms for different colleges, because now they're simplifying one form, and colleges are going to have to pick up the difference on the backside, right?
Yeah, you go from 100 plus questions that is essentially meant to help a college, like a financial aid officer, see the family's financial picture. Well, now you go it down to 36. Okay, do you still have the same picture you did with the current FAFSA? Probably not.
Yeah, right.
So I think there's going to be some hiccups in there. When I think about the Pell Grant eligibility being increased and basically more people getting government money, my fear is that it's the old adage that, the way to solve the problem is to throw more money at it. Anybody that, if you've looked at anything, realizes that really you're throwing good money at a bad problem that doesn't solve the problem. So my concern is, we've already known that the cost of college is going to increase.
Yep.
And if now all of a sudden you're going to give more people
more money, and they
more free money, well, what are the colleges in essence going to be able to do? I'm not saying they're all going to do it, but look, we saw the government play a role a couple months ago with electric cars, and okay, everybody gets a subsidy, $7,500 if you buy an electric car. What happened the next day? Every car went up $8,000.
Yep. And there's no reason to think that wouldn't be the case with the schools as they increase every year. They're going to continue to, as long as things stay the same. And why would, a college, knowing that now more families are going to get more money, why wouldn't you look at that into?
Yeah. And it's funny. I remember I used this analogy years ago, and I still come back to it. And it was for a different reason at the time. But, imagine being in a grocery line, right? And you have your groceries lined up, and you go to pay the bill, and somebody behind you has the exact same cart, the exact same items. And it goes to you, and they ask, how are you paying? It's like, oh, out of pocket. It's like, okay, the bill's $35, right? Next person pulls everything up, and the same question, same items. And you go, well, how are you paying? It's like, oh, I have a government card. And it's like, oh, okay, the bill's $385. It's like, whoa, how's that? Well, because the store doesn't care, right? They know that the client, the person that's purchasing isn't paying. So they're going to charge more to make more of a profit. Like any business would take advantage of that. And schools are businesses without a doubt. So again, when you have that, now all of a sudden, I think part of this becomes, well, what about the families that don't qualify for Pell Grants? Now, does that mean that their cost goes up? And that's when we get into some of these other pieces that this is going to change. So some of the other big takeaways that, again, this draft has is there's something called an income protection allowance. And they are going to apparently increase that. And what an income protection allowance is basically, hey, if you make X amount of dollars, we are going to not count a portion of that income towards this EFC or student aid number. Now, right now, it depends on how many members of the family you have. Are you a single parent? Are you married? How many of the kids are in college at the same time? And all of how you answer those questions kind of increase the allowance that you get. Well, now that we're decreasing some of the questions, some of those allowances are actually going to go away.
Right.
And so one of the big things that's a change with this, and not just the income protection allowance, but also the way that the EFC is calculated right now, is when a family has 2 kids in school.
Right.
Right. So when somebody has 2 kids in school, like I will down the road, like if right now the system, how it works, my expected family contribution, let's just say it's $50,000. Well, when my first son goes to school, his EFC is $50,000. When my daughter gets to school, the way the system is now, Well, because if nothing changed, then the number should be 50. It gets divided by how many members of, how many kids you have.
Exactly.
So now all of a sudden their EFC goes down to 25. So at that point, my daughter is now eligible for more money, right? And my son, again, he would technically be eligible for more money. So having two kids in school, all of a sudden, hey, in certain situations, my kids may have not been eligible for a Pell Grant. And now when I have two kids in school, now they are. That now goes away. Mm-hmm. And so one of the big takeaways and one of the concerns that a lot of families are coming to me with, I don't know if you're hearing the same thing in your world with the families you meet with, is, okay, well, I'm now going to have to pay double for college, right? It's going to increase the amount I'm not going to get as much, qualify for as much aid. Yeah. So that's obviously a big deal.
Huge.
And
and that goes back to just kind of how I was saying earlier, making it then on the other side more complicated with the schools, because now that's not information that's gathered, right?
Yeah.
So it really becomes more of a school by school basis on, do they care? Are they going to collect that information?
Right.
And like you had been explaining to me, the panel of people discussing it from different schools, represented from different schools, all have different answers.
Yeah. Yeah. And so again, when we're breaking down this new FAFSA that's going to be coming out, a couple of things. Okay. So they change a name of EFC and they change the verbiage of it, but it does the same thing. Yep. And in my opinion, doesn't actually make anything clearer. I think exactly what you said. It's going to be, oh, great. My student aid index is 50,000. That's how much I'm going to get for school. I think it does the reverse rather than say expected family contribution. That's what I have to pay, Okay. Regardless. But the fact that this formula is going to change some things for certain families is a very big deal. The other side, they are going to change when there's a case of divorce separation, right? So again, right now, like you do import, you answer questions from your tax return, but when you have that case of a divorced family or, kids' parents are separated, right now, only one parent has to fill out that financial aid form, and it's determined by one question, which is who does the student live with for the majority of time for the past 12 months. That's it.
Right.
And that's parents, that's their income, their assets that go towards calculating that expected family contribution. Well, again, because they're eliminating some questions, and the way they're eliminating questions is relying solely on a tax return. Well, that also is going to change because now it's going to be the parent who provides more financial support. Well, how are you going to know that? Right. And well, and obviously it's going to be probably how I'd take that is to say you're going to have both parents have to file their tax returns, and whoever has the higher numbers is essentially going to be that. Now they're also really tying in dependents into this. And this really starts to where I say makes things complicated, because right now it's, you just say, this is how many family members I have. It doesn't have to be a dependent on your tax return. So, I know there's plenty of families that I work with that are divorced, and hey, one year dad takes the kids as dependents to help with taxes. The next year mom takes them, or hey, dad makes more money. So the deal was I get them as dependents, but you take care of the kids. So what that ends up doing is causing some problems, because now you might have a family of 5 people, but in the FAFSA now you only can technically, how you file your taxes, be a family of 2.
Yeah.
If you're divorced, and now all of a sudden you don't get all that income allowance, because again, the allowance is kind of different with how many family members you have, the higher it goes. So again, where now I go back and how this thing becomes a little bit more complicated, and why I'm calling it the College Complication Act, is you also have to realize what tax year they use, right? Mm-hmm. So how does that work? We call it prior. Explain that to the listeners today.
Yeah, the rule of thumb I tell people is, what year does your student graduate from high school? Mm-hmm. Take 2 years off. That's the tax year. So basically what happens is, like, if you have a senior right now, they're graduating in 2023 and they're going to start college in the fall of 2023. Mm-hmm. Well, you had filled out the financial aid form in the fall the year before, right? 2022. So if you have a senior, you've been going through this process. Well, they're asking for the last year's taxes. So if you have a senior, they start college in 2023, you fill out their financial aid information and paperwork in 2022, and they're going to ask for 2021's taxes.
Right.
Which is why this process is starting, and starts a lot sooner than people really think.
Yeah, it's January of sophomore year is really when this process, because that's the tax year that they're going to be seeing. But now basically you say, okay, well, let's just say that somebody goes and files their taxes. They have a junior and they file their taxes. They're a divorced family and they file them in March, right? And then they're applying to schools and they're going to fill out these financial aid forms the following out, that October.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what if you didn't know how the whole system has been changed? And now all of a sudden, your one spouse has the kids as dependents and you don't. Well, now they're essentially going to have to use that parent as the custodial parent. And that was the reason that we kind of did it was because that person makes more money. Well, now all of a sudden you might qualify for less aid.
Right.
Right. So I think it's they're taking out some of the questions that essentially, again, when you know the system and you know how to answer, I'm not saying lie, but when you say, hey guys, when you work with somebody like us, right, we can teach you like this is how the questions have to be answered. So do this 2 years prior. So it's legally the right thing, to do. And kind of, again, it's like a good accountant. It's not a good accountant doesn't necessarily save you money on the, when he files the taxes. No, it's the advice that he gives before the tax year starts to say, do this that year. Same thing from the college side. So now all of a sudden you're saying, okay, well, this just got a little bit more complicated, even though there's less questions. There's actually more that I have to do and I have to do it sooner.
Mm-hmm.
And I think another takeaway, they don't really get into the draft on this, but it does seem like another thing that is going to be weighed more heavily moving forward are assets, basically like your worth, right? Not retirement accounts. It still seems like they're not going to be asking for retirement accounts, but more, what do you have in non-retirement assets? Your cash, savings, checking, 529s. It seems like they're going to put more of an emphasis on the student aid index number based on what you have versus the EFC. That's kind of a little bit more heavily weighed on
what you make,
what you earn. Right. So again, you got to know how certain vehicles affect you, what the effect they're going to have in the future. But again, we might not know that until July.
Exactly.
So how do you know what to do? It doesn't right now. It's not making things easier. It's making that there's a lot of questions that we don't have answers to yet. And I'm saying that's not simplifying anything. I got 100 questions that I can't give, potential. Do I do this? Do I do that? I don't know. We don't know what the system's going to be.
Right. And that's what I typically tell people when I'm explaining how it works. We're like, hey, you have the FAFSA form, and then some schools use the CSS profile as another form, and then other schools will have a third form.
Yeah.
And they get all, oh man, I don't want to do all that. And I try to explain, hey, just because they're asking more questions doesn't mean you're going to be paying more necessarily. They're trying to gather more information. They're trying to do their due diligence. And when you remove so many questions and you make it simple, right? Well, now there's two families that may have looked very different when you ask 120 questions.
Yeah.
But they look almost the same when you ask them 36, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and that's a good point. And that really ultimately brings me to, I would say that the big takeaway that I share, and you alluded to this a couple times already, is like right now, essentially it's typically private schools and more schools that give more of need-based aid, use the CSS profile. It's an additional financial aid form that's done through the College Board website. It's not as many questions as the FAFSA is right now, but it's more in-depth questions. They do ask about, the value of your home and what your mortgage balance is, because they take equity of your primary residence to account, where right now the FAFSA doesn't. They ask about retirement accounts where the FAFSA doesn't, but they also ask a lot more questions, like they asking you about expenses, medical expenses, dental expenses. Do you pay for private school? They ask for other circumstances that, again, the FAFSA doesn't bring in to account. And their formulas are a little bit different. In an example, a CSS profile, essentially the general formula that's accepted is, if you have younger kids, they actually account for that. That helps with some of the allowances that you get, where the FAFSA right now only cares about if you have two kids in school at the same time. Now that's going away completely. And again, watching some interviews with a few different financial aid officers about these potential changes, the ones that use the CSS profile have all said, well, we're still going to use the CSS profile formula. We're still going to give discounts to families that have two kids in school. It goes into our decision on how much aid we give somebody. Right. Now, again, the CSS profile a little bit different than the FAFSA. When you file the FAFSA, you have an EFC. And if a school only requires the FAFSA, it's the same number at every school. CSS profile, you don't get that luxury as a parent. You don't know what your EFC is. You're basically just saying, here's my answers to all the questions you ask. Now the financial aid officer has to determine, okay, what is an appropriate award that we should give you that we think makes this college affordable, right? Based on all this information. That's ultimately what the CSS profile does. And again, hearing differences from Notre Dame, right? Villanova, USC, they take the CSS profile information, but they use it all a little bit differently, right? USC went into, hey, you got 2 kids in school, right? I take that into account. I always am going to take that into account. But your one child goes to community college. The other child wants to come to us, right? They're not going to use the same formula as if another child is going to University of Pennsylvania, right? And then they also want to know, well, what are you paying at University of Pennsylvania? Where a school like Notre Dame and Villanova, they don't take that into account, right? So that's where you can essentially get very different, numbers at even schools that both meet 100% of need, right? And what I mean by that is you take all, USC and Notre Dame, both schools very high sticker price. And again, when you put to that calculation, that formula we mentioned, the cost of attendance minus the EFC or student aid index, that's your need, right? So let's just say we're talking an $80,000 school and your expected family contribution or student aid index is, again, $30,000, right? So you have a $50,000 need. What the USC and Notre Dame does is they meet that $50,000, right? But again, you could have that same family with a $50,000 EFC and all of a sudden Notre Dame is saying, hey, you got to pay 25 to come to us, right? Even though, well, wait a minute, my EFC was 30 because they did some things different with the CSS profile, where then USC might say, we're actually going to ask you to pay 15. It's like, whoa, why? These two schools both meet 100% of need. Why is it that their numbers are so different? It's because they take almost on a case-by-case basis and they have almost their own formula with what they do with this, but they also look at it and say, what do they think is a good offer? Because they do want to help. They do want to make college financially affordable.
Right.
And that's something you never hear about in, anyone right now in the news. It doesn't matter what you're listening. All you hear is how high the cost of college is, but nobody talks about what families are actually paying to attend those schools. And that's because, look, financial aid officers, they're very good,
right?
But they're human beings. They have feelings. They can see what a family looks like. And if they're going to struggle, they want to be able to help them out, but also they may be limited in how much money can they give out each year, right? It's run like a business. So they have to be selective on who they give how much money to, right? They want to try and get the best students. They want to try and find kids that are a good fit, and they want to make it financially affordable. But again, you can go through the process, say, well, both schools meet 100% of need, but still get asked to pay very different numbers. And so even after hearing all these, different financial officers, they also said, they said, we're going to have to keep the CSS profile. And they all kind of alluded to, saying they don't know how a financial aid officer at a school that only requires the FAFSA, which again, maybe some not, like in our area outside of, you look at, St. Joe's, you look at LaSalle, you look at, Cabrini, Immaculata, like all these schools only require the FAFSA.
Right.
But they want to be able to give money out to families. They want to try and make it more affordable. Well, how are they going to be able to determine how much money a family needs? Right. If all they have are these 36 questions, they're not going to have as much. So this is where I'm going into prediction mode, and saying, I think what's these smaller private schools, one of two things going to happen. They're either all going to become schools that require the CSS profile, or those schools are going to create their own financial form.
Missing information.
Right. So, and this is why I say that College Complication Act, but I don't know what I just said, Complication Act, right? Is because let's just say my son wants to apply to LaSalle, St. Joe's, Cabrini, Immaculata. Right now, obviously, we have to fill out an application to each of those schools, or maybe use the Common App. So all of a sudden you say, okay, great, I can do the Common App, fill it out once, send it to these schools. Well, then the FAFSA works the same way. I fill out the FAFSA one time and it gets sent to all those schools. With this new process, I think these schools are either going to say, well, you have to do the FAFSA and the CSS profile, or you have to do the FAFSA and our own individual. And now if all of a sudden these schools don't use the CSS profile, now I got to fill out an application to each of those schools and the FAFSA, and then an individual form for each one of those schools. So now you go, oh my God, well, are all the schools going to ask the same questions? is it may not be a uniform form like the FAFSA is now, right? The CSS profile, it's the same questions. And then you send it. So you fill the form out once and send it to multiple schools. So you kind of look and say, oh my God, wait a minute. So now parents may have to fill out more forms and they may have to answer more questions. And now all of a sudden, it's not just that you have to fill out more forms, but every form is different. The order of questions is different. How they word the questions is different.
Yeah.
Oh my God, this didn't make anything simpler.
Right. And because like you said, each school, each aid officer, they're going to have their own approach to it. Right. So why would the questions all be the same across the board? Right. And to make it clear too, like when we talk about those 36 questions, if that still sounds like a lot, you got to keep in mind things like parents' email, number, like that's part of those questions. Right. So,
yeah, I mean, and I think I actually, I wrote it down just to say, hey, this is what I think the new FAFSA will look like based on this. And I basically said, all right, here's the 36 questions. And I have it written right now. Ready? Student name, student gender, race and ethnicity, student social security number, student date of birth, student address, student phone number, student email, student high school.
Yep.
College selections, students dependency questions. So basically a couple questions on, are you married? How old, are you independent, or do you live with your parents, or your parents married? Right. So the next, parents' marital status. Then you got your parent name, parent social security number, parent date of birth, parent address, parent email, parent phone.
Right.
Then you got the other parent name, social security, date of birth, email address, phone. Then I got, did your parents file a tax return? And if it's yes, import. That's it. Did the student file a tax return? Yes or no? If yes, import. How much do your parents have in cash savings and money market? How much money do your parents have in stocks, mutual funds, education accounts? How much money in child support was received? What's the net worth of real estate and vacation homes? What's the net worth of your business? And then your student, how much does a student have in checking, savings, money market? How much does a student have in stocks, bonds, mutual funds, education accounts? How much does a student have in real estate and business?
Yep.
There's 36 questions. And almost all of those is pretty easy to answer.
Yeah. Half of them are just barrier to entry identification information, right?
So again, like think about it. If you're in a position like, I mean, God, let's just say you're a loan officer, right? At a bank. It's like, well, I might need a little bit more information than this. Like, what about a pay stub? Right. Like, I mean, there's going to be other questions, right? Well, would you have other expenses? Like, how do I know what you can afford? If I'm going to lend you money, I need to know your picture before I know if you can pay it back.
Right.
Well, okay, we're not doing that here. And so again, what I think this will ultimately be is that, again, when schools, when you get an award letter from a college and you're given aid, right? There's different types of aid that's out there. There's gift aid, there's grants and scholarships, and that's free money. That's money that never has to be paid back. That's, hey, brings the cost of college down. Then there's the self-help stuff. Self-help is the direct government loans. It's a work study, right? And it's, basically there. Now, from the government side, the only money the government can give a family is a Pell Grant, right? And a direct loan. And a direct loan, again, can be subsidized, which is 0% interest while the kids are in school. So what I think is going to end up happening is saying, well, this FAFSA is only going to determine if you're eligible for a Pell Grant, how much of the Pell Grant money you get each year, and then how much of your direct loans that'll be offered will be subsidized. But that's it, right? Schools use this form to determine how much of their own money do they have to give you, right? And that's institutional money. And because the questions get so small now, I think the schools are going to need more information like the CSS profile to say, okay, look, the FAFSA is just for the government. It has nothing to do with what money we are going to offer you out of our own bucket. That's where the CSS profile or the school's individual form will come in. And so again, now you're looking at saying, all right, well, now this process got a little bit harder because, again, we can do a calculation on a student aid index. We can do a calculation on an EFC. We can do a calculation on the general idea of what most schools use for the CSS profile. But what if a school now starts using their own formula? We can't predict what every school is going to be. So now, we always tout that, hey, when you're looking to find a school, you got to find a school that's got that social fit, the academic fit, and the financial fit. Like, hey, you're somewhere where you want to be. right? You're happy to be on campus. You know you're going to stay there for 4 years and not want to transfer school because the social environment is a great fit. Academically, they have the program you want. You know, it has the right academic rigor. It has the class size that I need. And then also we can afford it. Nobody's going into debt. When all of a sudden, when some of this things get more complicated, it's, well, I might not know beforehand if a school is affordable or not.
Right.
And that's where I start to look at this and go, okay, well, I don't think this is going to make things easier on families. I think it might make things a little bit harder. And then the last piece that I think is, in my world, probably the biggest difference is for family-held businesses and business owners. Now, the reason I say in my world is, you know, look, what I do day in, day out is build strategies and plans for families to, hey, keep this EFC as low as possible so that you qualify for as much aid. And then when you get the bill for college, how do you pay for it?
Right.
Right. That's what we do. That's what I do, you know, day in and day out with hundreds of families every year. But now, and when I work with business owners, I can look fantastic because, again, it's kind of saying like, hey, I know as a business owner, you can do certain things. You can change things around a little bit, right? The FAFSA right now has what's called a small family business exclusion, right? So if you basically own a family held business and there's less than 100 full-time employees, the business assets don't count towards that EFC. They're doing away with it. And now all of a sudden you're saying, okay, I own a pizza shop. You know, me and my wife, you know, and my kids work at this store.
All right.
We don't have a lot of money because our money is all in the business. You know, that money's not liquid. That used to be excluded. The government would say, yeah, we understand you're trying to grow the economy. You're a business owner. We're going to give you a little bit of a break because of what you're doing, what you're providing to society.
Mm-hmm.
They're getting rid of it. And now all of a sudden you go, oh crap, that's a big deal. The other thing is that when you really look at like family held businesses, again, now all of a sudden you have to start considering much more factors on, should you be an LLC? Should you be a sole prop? Should you be an S corp? Right? There's advantages from a tax perspective for all of those. But now when you throw this new financial aid system and the formula, those can have completely different outcomes on this student aid index depending on how you file. Like a very big difference, right? How you contribute to retirement accounts. Mm-hmm. Very big difference than how the system works today. So I look at it and say, all right, well, now if I'm a business owner, I got to figure out all these things, right? Even if, you know, and then when you say I'm a family and I'm going to try and have a strategy for, you know, things. Well, now all of a sudden, unless there's across the board, we know that there's a formula that all schools are going to use. There's going to be a specific form and formula for government money. Then there's going to be a specific form and formula for institutional money. They used to be like, right now, they're not that much different. There's just a few extra pieces that get added to the private school. But now, because they're so much different, well, now all of a sudden, I look at it and say, oh my God, you need to really start thinking about what schools you may be interested in. Because, and a lot earlier, because, well, if you're looking to get into an Ivy League education, if you're looking to the schools that meet a higher percent of need, if you're looking at schools that use the CSS profile, and we kind of know how their formula has worked in the past, you can do certain things to keep the price of school down. But those things will actually increase right now what's going to happen with the student aid index, and vice versa. There are things that you can do for the student aid index that will bring that number down to get more government money, but it's going to increase what the private schools see. And now all of a sudden they won't give you as much of their money. And so I go, oh God, now you need to start thinking about what colleges might be a good fit before January of sophomore year of high school. Mm-hmm. Look, I'm all for planning early and paying less, and I'm all for kids starting to get a feel of what colleges are. But to be able to have to ask a college, or a high school sophomore I got to know what schools you're thinking about because I need to financially plan for it the best way. That's a lot to ask to put on a family.
Absolutely.
That's insane.
Absolutely. And like when I meet with people, my line when we start kind of really is, all right, guys, well, we don't need to know, if it's a freshman, right?
Yeah.
We don't need to know what school we're picking right now.
Right.
But it is important that we start to look at the financial side of it, right? That's going to change.
Yeah.
Because now we're at a point where, I'm not saying that, hey, you have to know exactly what major you're going to have. But you need to know now that it's going to be so specific for each school, you have to have some sort of a gauge of what we're looking at.
Right.
Because if you say, I don't know, I'm kind of all over the map. Well, it's going to be really difficult to get in the right position for that. Whereas on the other side, I'm thinking you talk to a sophomore and say, yeah, I'm thinking Penn State and I'm thinking Pitt, and then all of a sudden you get to senior year and his friends are all applying to, UVA or Villanova. Yeah. And he's like, hey, you know what? I think I'm going to throw an application out there too.
Yeah. And now all of a sudden Villanova costs more, right? And there could have been things that you did the year prior to look better on a CSS profile and potentially bring the price of Villanova down. And now, hey, ends up being that if that's the school, it's the best social and academic fit for you. Now it doesn't fit the financial side. And that's where people fall into that trap where I want to send my kid to that school. They worked hard, they got in. Yeah, but who's going to pay for it, right? You're going to put your retirement at detriment, or your kid's going to graduate with a mountain of debt and not be able to start off their adult life, And so I think, kind of in our world, I think ultimately what it ends up really trying to, I think, teach families now. And again, this is if this thing actually does go forward and goes forward. Like if you've got after freshman year of high school, you got to start looking at, visiting colleges and understanding what at least the social fit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. I think you can kind of get a gauge on how far away from home do you want to be? What part of the country do you want to be at?
Classroom size.
Yeah. Do you want to be in the city? Do you want to be in kind of a town setting? Do you want to be in the middle of nowhere? Look, kids, you want different things. You have to start figuring at least that side out. So then you can kind of have a gauge on, all right, at least from the social side, we know what type of school, what area of the country, again, how big, how small, right? What the classroom size is like. You can figure some of those pieces out.
Right.
And then you can say, all right, well, those schools would cost this. Are they affordable or not? All right, you can do some things to bring that cost down. And now those schools that you thought were unaffordable now are. You probably don't know the career path and the academic, fit just yet, but you're going to have to start this process earlier than you do now. And that's where I just think, again, I call this the College Complication Act because of this reason. I just think, and again, realize, guys, that, this is one of those things that as a parent, right, or even as a student, you got to know this game. And it's a game. You got to know the game while you're in it, right? And then once your kids are out of it, you're done.
Right? Doesn't matter after that.
But again, this process, this formula, it changes every single year, right? It's a lot. I refer to this as from taxes, so much because again, tax codes can change, and what you did right one year to lower a tax liability might increase the tax liability in the next year, right? It's not always uniform. There are some things that are set in stone. This is going to be the same way, but this is where, this is where advisors that use the College Planning Network, right? Us here at Elite Collegiate Planning, Paradigm Financial Group, we are always up to date. So our families don't have to be the ones that know, and there are people out there like us that, look, I hear it every day. And we didn't know someone like you existed. We didn't know that there were people that specialized in true college planning, not just put money in a 529, right? We have those, that piece of trying to help families find that social, academic, and financial fit, and then say, this is how you accomplish these things. So the game is obviously going to change for us. So we need to know the rules. We need to know the laws to give our clients the best advice moving forward. Well, again, there's other people out there that you need to potentially take advantage of to make sure you're not making mistakes, right? And this, I think now will hold true more than ever, is everybody I know says, well, hey, my coworker, my friends, so-and-so did this. This is how I'm going to do it. Well, guys, guess what? If your coworker that put a kid through college last year, right, did one thing, and now you're saying you're going to do the same thing, guess what? The entire formula just changed. And what they did might have worked 2 years ago, and you're thinking it's great. Now, guess what? It ain't going to work anymore. Now it might be absolutely awful. And that's not a route to go anyway, ever.
Yeah, because on top of that, it's unique to every family anyway.
Everybody is different, and people say, oh, well, this is how much money they make. I make the same amount of money. there's so much more that goes into the college, again, a financial aid offer than just your income. Don't think that you're going to be excluded from all aid because you make a certain amount of money. It does not work that way. Again, it's a formula. It's an aspect of the formula, right? But again, it's going to be very different where now all of a sudden, okay, you might be eliminated from certain government aid, but you're not eliminated from the institutional money. So you definitely need to make sure that you understand this. And again, it's a lot and it's always changing. And there are people out there like us that know this stuff day in and day out, and guide families day in, day out, right? Every year, as these things come up, we're guiding our families. And that's ultimately where, again, I don't want to say you can do this. It is possible to do what I do and read these things and say, okay, what am I going to do and understand the formula? But it takes a lot of time. Like, this is what I do for a living. Somebody else that you got a 9 to 5 and you're taking kids to sports and you're doing, there's not a whole lot of time to learn all these changes and how this is going to be applied to your specific situation. There's people out there where you can get help. And that's what we do. It's what our advisors that use the College Planning Network, who's one of our proud sponsors, by the way. That's essentially what they do. So there is help out there. Don't think that you always have to go with this thing alone. And just be aware of God, this thing can change drastically year over year. Yep.
Absolutely. I know in my tagline there, it's always say it's the sooner the better, late's better than never. And it's just becoming more and more true.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I mean, I think I don't want to get political. We've had a couple political episodes and, what's going on with loan forgiveness or trying to do that. And it's, loan forbearance and direct loans from the government and how that's caused such a student debt crisis and all these things. Ultimately, I sit back and I look at something like this that is in theory meant to try and help college affordability. And in reality, I think for the overwhelming majority of families, it's actually going to increase the cost. That's my fear with this. And again, just like, we've seen time and time again, when the government steps in to try and do something, it doesn't always make things better. I'm not here to say the government's good, the government's bad. I'm just saying, hey, I know how the formula works here. This is not something that is going to help a lot of people. I think it's going to be something that, and I don't mean help in a way of like financial.
Right.
I just mean, again, I think that this is going to make this whole college planning process more time consuming, more misunderstood. There's going to be more myths around the college process. I think it's going to take the FAFSA, and not that it won't be as important, but now it's going to be just one of the things rather than for a lot of schools, it's the only thing you need to do.
I think it's barrier to entry.
Now I think it's going to be, hey, you got to do this and this and this as well. And I think ultimately that's where parents are just going to start to get lost through this process. So changes coming. Again, I don't think they're all good.
Right.
But I think, and again, this is us reading between the lines as far as what I'm anticipating. I'm still, again, they're sending out a draft. So we still don't know.
Right. But I
exactly
think it's safe to assume there are changes on the horizon.
Yeah, I think without a doubt. Look, this is a law that was passed.
Correct.
And the main reason that I'm hearing that it may be delayed is not because they don't think the law is going to work. Right. They truly believe this. This thing's going to move forward at some point. But again, because this FAFSA is basically going to rely solely on a tax return, the struggle apparently is they have right now what's called an IRS data retrieval tool. You basically input your name, your address, your social security number, how you filed, married, single, and then it imports some answers off the tax return. But now it's importing so many more things off of there. And I think they're struggling to make this import tool work. And that is the reason that I've heard on why it may be delayed a year or two, because until they can get this thing to work completely, obviously you can't file a financial aid form. You can't file the FAFSA if the only way that they get the majority of the information needed is by submitting a tax return. Right. So that's where I think that they're struggling, which again, we don't know what's going to happen, but it's going to happen at some point. Right. I'm sure there's very smart people in the government that can work out a data retrieval tool, but here or there, I definitely could see potentially some things. And I know one of our other consultants brought up, he's like, That's great. It's you're going to hit import, but you're not going to see any of the answers that were actually on the form to know if they were right or not. Did it import the right line? Did my accountant or me, when I was filing my own taxes, put a number in there that was wrong? I put it on line 21, not line 22.
Right.
And it imports line 21 when it should have been an import, it imports line 21 where there should have been a zero, and now there's $22,000 in there. Your student aid index goes through the roof. Like, again, I think there are some potential complications with it. But again, we're going to take it. We're going to see as things change. We'll be here. College Knowledge Podcast will always be here to guide families and kind of update families as things come on. And I guess we'll wait and see. But look at it and say, change isn't always bad. And again, in my world, that's why I love this job. It's never Groundhog's Day.
Oh yeah.
Every family's different. And now all of a sudden you're telling me, well, I got every family, and now I might have different formulas to run. Like, look, that excites me.
Yeah.
I know not many people live in my realm of wanting to figure out a solution by kind of understanding formulas. But look, I mean, part of this is like, I know what we do. I know what I do for a living. And my goal is to help those families. I know that's what you do as well. And this just says that, like, parents are going to need people like us more than ever.
Yeah.
And so, like, I'm glad I know that we're here, because again, as this thing gets more complicated, it's going to be very real, how we help families.
Absolutely.
So, Clay, final thoughts? Student aid index, new FAFSA. Any final thoughts that you would like to bring up before we?
Yeah, I mean, I just say it's safe to assume that change is going to happen, right? This stuff changes all the time. And like I usually tell families when I sit across from it's the stuff that doesn't make front page news, right? So unless you're a bookworm about this kind of stuff, like we have to be, you're probably not going to always see what those changes are. So I always stress the importance of starting it early, but like I just said there before, the school choice factor, it's always been incredibly important, sometimes overlooked. It's just going to be that much more important.
Absolutely.
Regardless of what happens with these changes, it's going to be more important year after year.
Yeah, without a doubt. Great way to shut it down. So guys, thanks for listening to this episode of College Knowledge. Again, hopefully if you're listening to us, thank you. Make sure you like us. We're now on YouTube. All of our podcast episodes are now on video. You can see us instead of just hear us. So make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe, hit the notification bell, be brought up to date with all of our future videos when we drop some elite college knowledge week after week. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the College Knowledge Podcast with your hosts, Dave Kozak and Joe Kearns. We hope you enjoyed this week's exploration of higher education, sponsored by the College Planning Network and Paradigm Financial Group. That's all for this episode. See you next time.